Hey everyone, it's Ryan from Arcade High, back again with another Synthwave series tutorial. This is number 6, and I know it's been 5 years since the last one. I have no excuse other than I am lazy. So today we'll be going over the basics of synthesis. This is very ground level, beginner stuff. So if you know nothing about synthesizers or very little, this is going to kind of be where you want to begin. And the purpose of this tutorial is to kind of go over the sort of handful of components in most of your garden variety synthesizers so that whether you're using Logic, Ableton, FL Studio, you can kind of fumble your way around any of the plugins or even hardware synths that you're using to kind of make your own patches. We'll be using RetroSynth here built into Logic Pro 10. We'll be going over only the analog tab. The sync, table, and FM tab might come for later videos, but we'll keep it simple for now. And we'll begin our journey into synthesis by going over, first and foremost, the oscillator. Now, an oscillator is the bread and butter component of any synthesizer, and essentially an oscillator is a tone generator, and it will generate a tone that will have a certain sound depending on the wave shape that you choose. Now, some synthesizers will give you all different kinds of options for wave shapes. You have some that will let you generate your own, but universally there are 4 basic wave shapes, and they are as follows: sine wave, triangle wave, square wave, and finally sawtooth. And then using multiple oscillators in your synth, you can blend these sounds together to create more interesting and dynamic sounds for your patches. Alright, so let's just dive in and take a closer look at some of these wave shapes here. So I have ES2 open here. This is a built-in Logic plugin. I'm just using it to show off a sine wave. Over here we have an EQ or equalizer. If you're not familiar with EQs, it works from low to high, left to right, with lower frequencies or pitches down here, with the sub down here, and then at the top of human hearing at 20,000 hertz here. And then this is an oscilloscope. This is a free plugin from Smart Electronics called Exoscope. You can download it online. This is going to show us the actual shapes of our waves as we play them. So let's listen to a sine wave. And as you can see, a sine wave generates a single tone. It's just a fundamental. I play a key and there are no partial harmonics, or partial tones rather, above that. It's a very pure sound. So now jumping back over to RetroSynth, we'll take a look at our other wave shapes. Now in RetroSynth, we have 2 oscillators, 1 and 2. Right now I have it on the initialize patch or initialize setting. Most synthesizers will call this init or INIT. It has the filter turned off, the effects turned off, etc. So right now we're just listening to oscillator 1, and I'm going to move this down to 2 because our next wave shape is triangle. And you can see there are now partial tones here in the frequency spectrum. That's giving it kind of its own characteristic. Moving up to square wave, you'll see the same thing. But these harmonics now are different, so it has a very different sound. And finally, sawtooth. Kind of a buzzy sound. And one final thing you can do with square waves is something called pulse width modulation. And what that does is it's represented by this little guy right here. You'll see this often on a lot of different synthesizers. And this is a pretty accurate depiction because as I drag this up, and you'll see this happen in the oscilloscope, is it's going to change the width of the actual shape of the square wave itself. And you can get your fun Game Boy sounds with this. Alright, just a couple other parameters real quick I want to touch on here. We have our semitones knob and our sense knob. Now in this synthesizer in RetroSynth, these two are only going to affect oscillator 2. Now a lot of synthesizers, you'll have a semitones or a sense knob for both oscillators, but this one we just have it for the second one. So as I move this knob, it'll tune oscillator 2 in semitones. And in this particular synth, it'll allow us 2 octaves up or down. And then moving the tuning in sense, it's a much finer tuning. So as we change this, it'll be a lot more of a subtle shift. And now the neat thing is, since we can change the second oscillator, the way that people typically will use this is they might turn semitones down to, let's say, an octave below on one oscillator. So now this one is playing this tone an octave down from oscillator 1. And you can blend these together. And so a fun little trick you can do is you can detune or change the sense of only the second oscillator, whereas before it was a pretty subtle shift alone, but now listen where oscillator 1 is not tuned or shifted at all, but will move the sense on only the second oscillator. So it adds a kind of a nice little chorus effect. This is called detuning, and it's pretty common when you're creating sounds to kind of get that lush sound. Moving on over to filter. Filter is a huge part of any synthesizer or any subtractive synthesizer. And the best way I can kind of illustrate this is using our EQ here, because EQ is essentially its own type of filter. So if I turn this on here, I can drag this number down and you can see it masks out certain frequencies depending on whatever number I put, and it's doing it at 24 dB per octave. That's just the slope we have here, and that can be changed as well, up and down. And this is called low pass. It's letting the lower frequencies through while cutting the highs. That's what the LP stands for over here. And the shape is also the same as our EQ to the right. So when I play this sound, we're hearing everything above 1600 hertz cut out, and I can move this around. And now remember, it's not changing the initial pitch of the key I'm pressing, it's just changing the frequency content within that pitch, or within that wave shape. So now we'll turn our filter on, and you'll see this is pretty much doing the same thing, but filters have their own color and qualities to them. Cool, so that's going to be kind of a big part of how we craft sounds here shortly. And another thing you can do with filters is something called resonance. That's what this RES is. So if I move the resonance up, it'll actually create a little peak or boost right at the threshold of when it starts to cut off. And it'll add a little spice to the sound, and you'll especially hear it as I move the cutoff up and down. And that can be kind of fun to play with. And we'll get more into filters, back to the filter when we get into our envelopes. We're going to jump over now to LFO. So LFO is low frequency oscillator, and a low frequency oscillator generates a tone that is well below human hearing, so typically below 20 hertz. And what you can do is you can tell that to modulate your main oscillators, which will cause them to drop in and out. So we're going to turn our LFO up here. And then as I play this and turn the mod wheel up on my MIDI keyboard, you'll hear it working. And I can change the rate of that. And you can also sync it to your BPM. So if I sync this, and I'll turn my mod wheel all the way up so you hear it. Oh, come on, get there. There we go. And then we have a second low frequency oscillator, the vibrato here. So I'm going to turn the LFO knob down because they do act separately. And when I turn vibrato up, this will affect both oscillators. And as I turn my mod wheel, we can hear the vibrato effect. So that's fun as well. So now that we've gotten those basics down, we're going to move over to probably arguably the most important part of a synthesizer is going to be the envelopes. And an envelope is a roadmap. Basically, it's a way of telling different components and different knobs on your synth to follow a certain path. And it's measured, as you can see, on the y-axis we have amplitude or amount, and on the x-axis we have time. And it's measured in milliseconds or seconds. Now, most commonly, synthesizers will already have these envelopes attached to your amplifier and your filter. Now, the acronym here, ADSR, stands for attack, decay, sustain, and then finally release. And so if you can imagine kind of an invisible dot starting at the beginning of our roadmap, and it begins when you press your key for the first time. Now, some synthesizers will actually give you a visualization of this in the envelopes where you can see a dot moving along the envelope. Unfortunately, RetroSynth does not give us that, so we'll just kind of have to imagine. But it begins when you press the key. It goes up your attack at whatever time you tell it, like I said, in milliseconds or seconds. It'll hit its highest point of amplitude, then begin decaying downward to its sustain level. And it's going to stay at the sustain level as long as you hold the key. Once you release the key, it begins the release, and then that's however long you want it to be. All right, so looking at RetroSynth, we have two envelopes that we can use to affect different things. We have the amp envelope and the filter envelope. Now, in other more complex synths, you'll have multiple envelopes that you can then decide what you want to attach them to. And in this synth, since it's pretty basic, it's just going to have two envelopes and they're already pre-attached, one to the amp, one to the filter. And our amp is actually the final destination of our signal in this synth. So on our envelope, we have attack, decay, sustain, and release. And we have these different nodes here we can move around to affect those elements. So if I move the first one over, we're changing our attack time. The second one left to right will change our decay, and then up and down will change our sustain, and then our final node will change our release. So if I put this kind of back to where it was, we have instant attack, almost an instant decay. The sustain is at 100%, and the release will also be pretty much instant. So I'm going to press the key, it'll immediately start, and then I'll release the key, it'll immediately stop. Now let's say I want to move the decay time out to say 3 seconds and the sustain down to a little below half. It will instantly hit the note, but it will take 3 seconds to go down in volume to the sustain level, and then when I release the key, it'll instantly turn off. And here's our sustain. If I hold this note, it'll continue at this volume level until I release it, and then it instantly turns off. Now let's move our release out to about a second. It'll do the same thing, but when I release the key, it'll take a second to get from the sustain level to 0. And release. Cool, so let's now move our attack time to about a second. So it'll take 1 second to reach this highest amplitude, 3 seconds down to our sustain level where we're holding our key, and then when I release, 1 second to get to nothing. And release. Neat. Okay, so we'll keep this about here for now. And then let's look at the filter envelope. And here's where things get really fun. Now, if I just turn the filter on, we know that this is going to be cutting out these higher frequencies. Let's change our release time so it's not quite so long. Because remember, our amp envelope is still active. But this knob here will tell it how much of this filter envelope will affect this. So right now it's not affecting it at all. It's completely disconnected. So let's move this up all the way. And so you might be wondering, well, wait, we have those frequencies cut out in the filter up here in the higher frequencies. Why are we still hearing them like we heard down here? But up here, you're hearing those frequencies, and that's where the actual envelope comes into play. When I move the decay and the sustain, it will tell our filter where we want that cutoff to end, and essentially doing it in milliseconds. So when I press the key, it's going to take the decay time, so right now 3 seconds, to move from here, hearing all the frequencies, down to here. At our sustain level, basically, it's how much of that I want here. So let's go ahead and play it. And then now the filter has reached a sustain level, and then I can let go, and then it releases pretty quickly. And then of course I can adjust the release time and get different effects. If I do instant release, you can hear kind of suck out because it's releasing at 1 millisecond. And we can can also do attack as well and get that kind of wow effect. We can pull this in even closer. And you can hear it taking, you know, that half a second here to get up to that point and then quickly decaying down to that sustain level and then releasing. So another thing we can do here is we can use resonance to affect the filter as well. We'll do 3 seconds again. We'll do our sustain level right about there. Keep that there. That should be fine there. We'll pull this down a little bit. We'll actually decay our sound there. And then with the resonance, you'll really hear it. And so what that's essentially doing is it's moving from here to here over the course of 3 seconds, but instead of us having to manually move this ourselves as we play the keyboard, the envelope, the roadmap is doing it for us. So let's adjust these around. Let's see if we can... I'll turn the sustain up a little bit there. Cool, so now what we can do is let's mix our oscillators so we're not just hearing the one single saw wave. And we'll do 50-50. We'll put this on a square. So we got a saw and a square at equal amounts. And then let's detune our square slightly. Nice. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of a chorus. Turn the effects on. Turn this down a little bit. And now one other thing I didn't mention before is on our amp section here, we have this sine level. Now this is the closest that this synth gets to a sub-oscillator, but this does not play a subtone. This will just simply create a sine wave, and it will be at the same frequency as oscillator 1. So with this up here, we're hearing a sine wave from here, a sawtooth, and then a square wave. So by adding this, it just sort of fills out our sound a bit more. And then we can also add a little bit of reverb, just using chroma verb, synth hall, pretty basic settings, and then some tape delay here. Dreamy. Cool, so now that we've gone over all the basic components of a synthesizer, in the next video, we're going to actually start looking at some patches and how to use these basic concepts to create different types of sounds from like a pluck, chords, pads, bass lines, etc., etc. If you enjoyed the video, please like, please subscribe. I know it's been 5 years. Hopefully we're going to do more of these. These do take a lot of work, so honestly, your feedback, your comments, your likes are really appreciated. And have a great rest of your day. See you next time. Stay rad.